October 14th, 1939. Scapa Flow, Orkney Islands, Scotland. 1 in the morning. This is the most heavily defended natural harbor in the British Empire, home to the Royal Navy's home fleet, ringed by submarine nets, block ships, and coastal batteries that have guarded this anchorage since the First World War. No enemy vessel has penetrated these waters in living memory, and the men commanding the fleet inside it sleep without a single thought of attack. Then, threading a gap between two sunken block ships on the surface of the water, in the dark, riding a strong tidal current that the Admiralty itself believes makes the passage unnavigable, a single German U-boat slips inside. Her crew can see the silhouettes of the home fleet's battleships against the northern sky. At 1:04 a.m., she fires 3 torpedoes at the nearest target, a 29,000-ton battleship called HMS Royal Oak. 1 hits. It barely registers. Officers aboard the ship assume an internal explosion, perhaps an accident in a paint locker, and go back to sleep. The submarine that fired it turns, reloads in the open water of an enemy harbor, and comes back. 20 minutes later, she fires again. This time, 3 or 4 torpedoes strike home in a single salvo. Royal Oak's magazines detonate. The battleship capsizes and sinks in 13 minutes, taking 833 men down with her. The submarine that did this then turns around, finds the same gap she came in through, and escapes back into the North Sea, undetected, to a hero's welcome in Germany. Her name was U-47. Her commander was 24 hours away from becoming the most famous submariner in the world, and the Royal Navy was about to learn that its safest harbor had never been safe at all. To understand why this attack should have been physically impossible, you have to understand what Scapa Flow actually was by 1939. It is a natural anchorage roughly 15 kilometers across, surrounded by the islands of Orkney, and it had been the main base of the British home fleet since before the First World War, specifically because its entrances were narrow, its currents were violent, and it could be sealed. After the German high seas fleet scuttled itself here in 1919, the Royal Navy studied every possible approach an enemy submarine might use, and closed most of them with sunken block ships, anti-submarine nets, and minefields. By 1939, only a handful of gaps remained passable at all, and naval planners considered the eastern approach through Kirk Sound functionally closed. The tidal currents there were strong enough, and the channel narrow enough, that no submarine commander in his right mind would attempt it on the surface in the dark. What nobody on the British side had fully accounted for was a single German Kapitänleutnant who had spent weeks studying exactly this problem before the war even began. Günther Prien, commanding the Type 7B submarine U-47, did not stumble into Scapa Flow. German naval intelligence had been quietly assembling aerial reconnaissance photographs and tide tables of the anchorage for months, identifying the gaps between the block ships at Kirk Sound that were too narrow for a destroyer, but, at the right moment in the tidal cycle, just wide enough for a U-boat running on the surface with her decks nearly awash. Prien was handed this intelligence and given personal discretion over whether the mission was survivable. He spent days calculating the exact state of tide and current that would let the flow itself carry his boat through the gap rather than smash it against the block ships, rather than relying on his engines to fight the current directly. This was not bravado. It was the same principle that had kept commerce raiders alive a generation earlier. Information control and precision timing substituting for brute force, because brute force was never going to get a submarine into that harbor. On the night of the attack, Prien brought U-47 in on the surface, using the current exactly as calculated to slide between the block ships at Kirk Sound, with barely meters of clearance on either side. Once inside, he found the anchorage far emptier than German intelligence had hoped. Most of the home fleet's capital ships had been moved out for exercises, but Royal Oak, an older Revenge-class battleship, was still there, anchored and dark. Prien's first torpedo salvo at 1:04 a.m. produced exactly the kind of ambiguous result that almost ended the raid in failure rather than triumph. Only one of 3 torpedoes struck, and it hit so far forward and caused so little obvious damage that officers aboard Royal Oak genuinely believed they had suffered an internal accident. Nobody sounded a general alarm. Nobody hunted for a submarine. If a single submarine slipping through Britain's most guarded harbor gap is the kind of story you want more of, subscribing helps the channel keep finding them. That confusion bought Prien the time he needed. Rather than fleeing immediately, which most commanders in his position would have done the instant a torpedo attack had even partially failed inside enemy territory, he turned U-47 around in the dark water of the anchorage, reloaded his bow tubes, and brought the boat back into firing position. At roughly 1:25 a.m., he fired a second salvo. This time, 3 to 4 torpedoes struck Royal Oak in immediate succession along her hull. The explosions detonated her forward magazine. A battleship displacing 29,000 tons, built to absorb punishment from enemy battleship guns, capsized and went down in 13 minutes. 833 of her crew, many of them boy sailors as young as 14 serving as the ship's band and trainees, were killed. Most trapped below decks or in the water in the dark, cold anchorage. It remains one of the highest single-incident loss-of-life events in Royal Navy history. Prien did not linger to confirm the kill. He turned U-47 back toward Kirk Sound, found his gap in the current exactly where his calculations said it would be, and slipped back out into the North Sea before the base had even organized an effective search. The strategic and psychological fallout was immediate and lasted the entire war. Scapa Flow had been the symbolic and literal heart of British naval security for 2 decades, and within hours the Admiralty had to confirm publicly that a German submarine had penetrated it, sunk a battleship at anchor, and escaped without a scratch. The home fleet was temporarily relocated away from Scapa Flow entirely, while emergency barriers, eventually built into permanent causeways still known today as the Churchill Barriers, were constructed to seal the gaps Prien had exploited. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, ordered the work personally, a direct admission that the base's defenses had failed catastrophically. In Germany, the propaganda value was treated as enormous. Prien returned to a personal reception from Adolf Hitler and became the first U-boat commander of the war awarded the Knight's Cross, his photograph appearing on magazine covers as the face of a renewed German submarine campaign just 6 weeks into the conflict. What U-47 proved in that single night was that the defenses a Navy trusts most are only as strong as the assumptions nobody is bothered to retest. The Royal Navy had judged the Kirk Sound approach unnavigable based on currents and channel width that were, on paper, accurate. They were not accurate against a commander willing to spend weeks calculating the one narrow window when those same currents would carry a submarine through rather than destroy it. Britain's most secure harbor fell not to a larger force, but to better information, used at the one moment it mattered. Du hast gesagt, Jon is the narrator, bitte erinnere mich daran.